A young illiterate girl hands a crumpled letter to a millionaire on the street. As he reads the words left by her deceased mother, his hands tremble and tears begin to fall. What was written in that letter that made a powerful man crumble in the middle of the street? Subscribe and activate it to discover this touching story. Leave a like if you're curious. Richard Ashford checked his wristwatch for the third time in 5 minutes. The meeting with the Japanese investors was scheduled for 10 a.m., and he couldn't afford to be late. His driver had chosen an alternate route due to an accident on the main avenue, which meant walking 2 blocks to the hotel where the meeting would take place. The streets were crowded, hurried people crossed his path, street vendors shouted their offers, and the smell of food mixed with car exhaust filled the air. Richard kept his gaze fixed ahead, ignoring everything and everyone around him. 15 years building his empire had not been achieved by wasting time on distractions. It was then that he felt a light tug on the sleeve of his Italian suit. "Please, sir." The voice was thin, almost a whisper. Richard continued walking, assuming it was just another beggar, but the tug came again, more insistent. "Please, I need help." He stopped and looked down. A girl of about 7 years was staring up at him with wide brown eyes. The pink dress she wore was stained and torn at the hem. Her dark hair was messy, and she held something against her chest with both hands. "I don't have any change," Richard said, motioning to move on. "I don't want money," the girl replied quickly. "I need you to read this for me." She extended a yellowed and crumpled piece of paper. Richard frowned. "Look for someone else on the street. I have an important appointment." "I already tried." The girl's voice became higher, close to desperation. "No one stops. No one listens to me. Please, sir, it's from my mother." Something in her tone made Richard hesitate. Perhaps it was the mention of her mother, or maybe the way she held that paper as if it were the most precious thing in the world. He sighed and quickly extended his hand. The girl then handed over the letter with a shy smile. Richard unfolded the paper and immediately recognized a feminine handwriting, shaky in some places but legible. He began to read silently, but the girl interrupted him. "Out loud, please, I want to hear." Richard cleared his throat, irritated by the time he was wasting, but began to read. "My dear Sophie, if you are reading this letter, well, you're not reading because I never managed to teach you. Forgive me for that. Forgive me for so many things." Richard's voice faltered. Something in those words troubled him, but he continued. "I need to tell you about your father. I never spoke about him because I thought it would be easier this way for me, for him, and especially for you. But now that I'm leaving, I realize I made a mistake. You deserve to know where you came from." Richard felt his mouth go dry. He continued reading, but now more slowly. "I met your father 8 years ago. I was working in a laundromat, and he was just a man trying to start a business. He wasn't rich. He wasn't powerful. He was just Richard, a man who made me laugh and made me feel special. We spent 3 months together, the 3 happiest months of my life." The paper trembled in Richard's hands. "It couldn't be. It wasn't possible. When I found out I was pregnant with you, Sophie, he had already left. I don't blame him. His business was growing. He was too busy to notice what we had. I didn't say anything either. I thought it would be a burden. So I raised you alone with all the love I had." Richard stopped reading. His heart was pounding so hard that he could hear the blood rushing in his ears. He looked at the girl, really looked at her for the first time. The brown eyes, the shape of her face, the way she tilted her head when she was nervous. "Continue, Sophie," he whispered, his voice choked. Richard resumed reading. "But now I am sick, my daughter. The doctors said I don't have much time and you need someone. You need your father. His name is Richard Ashford. He is an important man now, lives in a tall building downtown, wears expensive suits, and has a private driver. Maybe he won't remember me, maybe he won't care, but I ask you to seek him out. Show him this letter, tell You are his daughter. I have failed in many things, Sophie, but I cannot fail in leaving you alone in the world. With all my love, Mommy." The silence that followed was absolute, as if the whole world had stopped. Richard felt warm tears streaming down his face, something that hadn't happened in over a decade. People on the street began to look, some stopping to see what was happening. "Did you know my mother?" Sophie asked, with a fragile hope in her voice. Richard couldn't speak, he just nodded. "So you are my father?" He looked at that small child, dressed in rags, who could barely read and had just lost her mother. He looked into the eyes that were so similar to his, and something inside his chest, something he had locked away a long time ago, broke. "Yes," he whispered, "I am." Sophie didn't cry, didn't smile, just stood there looking at him as if trying to decide whether this was real or not. Richard knelt down, not caring that the pants of his suit were touching the dirty ground, and hugged her. She was so small, so fragile. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice breaking. "I'm sorry for not being there. I'm sorry for everything." Sophie finally returned the hug, her thin arms wrapping around Richard's neck. "Mom said you were good, just busy." Richard closed his eyes tightly. Busy. He had been busy building a fortune while his daughter grew up without a father, without school, without a future. The phone in his pocket started ringing. It was probably his assistant asking where he was. The billion-dollar meeting, the Japanese investors, all that money waiting to be made. None of that mattered anymore. Richard stood up, still holding Sophie's hand, and began walking in the opposite direction of the hotel. He had a lot to do, a lot to fix, and for the first time in years, he knew exactly what was truly important. Richard's apartment occupied the top floor of one of the most exclusive buildings in the downtown area. When the elevator doors opened directly into the living room, Sophie took a step back, startled by the size of the space. Floor-to-ceiling windows showcased the city below, small and distant. "Come in," Richard said gently, noticing her hesitation. Sophie entered slowly, her worn sneakers sinking into the Persian rug. She looked around, with wide eyes, as if she had stepped into another world. Richard observed his own home through her eyes and felt a pang of shame. How much money had he spent on this place? How much time had he spent choosing expensive artwork while his daughter grew up in conditions he didn't even want to imagine? "Are you hungry?" he asked. Sophie nodded, still looking around. Richard went to the kitchen and opened the fridge, realizing too late that there was nothing inside except mineral water and some takeout leftovers. He always ate out. "How about we order a pizza?" "Pizza?" Sophie's eyes lit up. "I've never had pizza." Richard felt his heart tighten again, picked up the phone and placed the order, choosing 3 different toppings because he didn't know which one she would like. While they waited, he sat on the sofa and motioned for her to sit beside him. Sophie settled at the edge, keeping her distance. "I need to ask you some questions." Richard started, trying to keep his voice calm. "Where were you living?" "With Mom?" "In a room we rented." "And after she left," Sophie shrugged, "the landlord said I had to leave. I slept on the street for 3 days until I could talk to you." 3 days. A 7-year-old child alone on the street for 3 days. Richard closed his eyes, taking a deep breath to control the anger he felt. Anger at himself, mostly. "Do you have anyone else?" "Grandparents, uncles." "Mom said her family didn't talk to her anymore. Because of me, because of you, because I was born. Mom never explained it well, but I know that's why." The intercom buzzed. Richard went to get the pizza and returned with 3 boxes. He opened them all on the coffee table and told Sophie to choose. She picked a slice of pepperoni pizza and took a small bite, chewing slowly as if she wanted to make it last as long as possible. "You can eat as much as you want," Richard said. "There's plenty." Sophie ate 4 slices before stopping. Richard had barely touched his, lacking appetite. His phone kept ringing. Messages from his assistant, his partners, the Japanese investors. He ignored them all. "Are you going to school?" he asked, although he already knew the answer. Sophie shook her head. "Mom wanted to enroll me, but we didn't have money. She tried to teach me to read, but she worked a lot and came home tired. What did your mom do? She cleaned houses, sometimes 3 or 4 a day. Her hands would be red and swollen." Richard stood up and went to the window, unable to face it at that moment. Outside, the city sparkled with its lights and promises. He had achieved all of that. But at what cost? While he was closing million-dollar deals, his daughter's mother was scrubbing floors until her hands bled. "Things are going to be different now," he said, still facing away. "You're going to live here with me. You'll have a room, new clothes, and you'll go to the best school." "You don't have to do that," Sophie said quietly. "Mom just wanted me not to be alone. You don't need to spend money on me." Richard turned around, surprised. "You're my daughter, Sophie. It's my responsibility to take care of you. But we don't know each other, so let's get to know each other." Sophie looked at her hands. "What if you don't like me?" The question hit Richard like a punch. He returned to the sofa and sat closer. To her, "This time, I will like you. I already do." "How can you be sure?" "Because you are brave. You spent 3 days alone on the street looking for me. Because you loved your mom enough to respect her last wish. Because you have kind eyes even after everything you've been through." Sophie finally smiled, a small, hesitant smile, but real. Richard's phone rang again. This time he answered. It was Mark Webb, his right-hand man at the company. "Richard, where the hell are you? The Japanese are furious. They cancelled everything. This is going to cost millions. Mark, I need you to come to my apartment now." "What, Richard?" "We have a crisis here, and I have a personal situation. I need your help." There was a pause. "Is everything okay?" "No, but it will be. Just come." Richard hung up and looked at Sophie, who was finishing another slice of pizza. He had so much to learn about being a father. He didn't know how to braid a girl's hair, didn't know what cartoons she liked, didn't know if she was afraid of the dark or if she slept well, but he was going to find out. He would take as much time as it took. Half an hour later, Mark arrived. He was a tall, thin man, always impeccably dressed, with grey hair slicked back. He stopped at the door when he saw Sophie on the sofa. "Mark, this is Sophie," Richard said. "My daughter." Mark opened and closed his mouth several times, processing the information. His daughter. "It's a long story, but I need your help to sort a few things out. I need clothes, a furnished room, and enrollment in a school. I need someone to help take care of her while I'm working. I need everything a 7-year-old child needs." Mark looked from Richard to Sophie and back to Richard. "All right, I can do that. But Richard, about the investors later, Mark, this is more important." For the first time since Richard had known him, Mark smiled genuinely. "I understand. I'll start making calls." As Mark jotted everything down on his tablet, the doorbell rang again. Richard frowned. He wasn't expecting anyone else. When he opened the door, he found a woman in her 50s, elegantly dressed, with a stern look he knew all too well. "Helen," he said, surprised. Helen Ashford, his stepmother, walked in uninvited. His father had married her 10 years ago, shortly before he died, leaving a considerable portion of his company shares to her. Since then, Helen had held a seat on the board and insisted on weighing in on every decision Richard made. "I heard you lost a $50 million deal today," she said, taking off her leather gloves. "I came personally to see if you've lost your mind." That's when she spotted Sophie on the sofa. Her eyes narrowed. "Who is this child?" Richard took a deep breath. "My daughter." The silence that followed was icy. Helen looked at Sophie with a pure, disdainful expression. "Your daughter," she repeated, her voice dripping with sarcasm. And where did she come from? That's none of your business, Helen. None of my business. Helen laughed, but it was a humorless laugh. I own 20% of the shares in the company you run. I have a seat on the board. Everything you do is my business, especially when it involves a child who suddenly appears claiming to be your heir. She's not claiming anything. She is my daughter. Do you have proof of that, a DNA test, or are you going to believe any story that's told to you? Richard stepped toward Helen, his voice low and dangerous. Watch what you're about to say. I'm being practical, Richard. You're one of the richest men in this city. People show up all the time trying to take advantage. And now you bring a street girl into your home and call her your daughter. The board will love to hear about this. Sophie shrank into the sofa, trying to make herself small. Mark stepped forward, placing himself between Helen and the girl. I think it's best if you leave, he said calmly. Helen ignored Mark and continued to glare at Richard. Get the DNA test. Prove she's really your daughter. Until then, I suggest you be more discreet. The press will have a field day if they find out about this. Get out of my house, Helen. Gladly, but let's discuss this at the next board meeting. And Richard, don't do anything reckless. The company can't afford to have an unstable leader. She left, slamming the door. The apartment fell into silence. Sophie had tears in her eyes, and Richard realized she had understood perfectly what Helen had insinuated. She's wrong, Richard said, kneeling in front of Sophie. You are my daughter. I know that, but let's get the test she asked for. Not to prove anything to her, but so you never have doubts. Okay? Sophie nodded, wiping her tears with the back of her hand. And don't worry about Helen. She's bitter and cruel, but she can't separate us. Mark approached. Richard, she's right about one thing. The press, if they find out about Sophie before you're prepared, will turn this into a circus. Then let's get prepared quickly. As Mark went back to taking notes, Richard looked at Sophie. She looked so tired, so small on that huge sofa. He had spent the entire day worrying about logistics and Helen, but he had forgotten the most important thing. Are you tired? He asked gently. Sophie nodded. I'll show you your room. For now it will be the guest room, but tomorrow we'll buy everything new, just the way you want. He led her to the room at the end of the hallway. It was Spartan, with just a double bed and a wardrobe. Sophie looked around and then looked at Richard. It's too big, she said. Too big, Mom. Too. And I slept together on a mattress on the floor. I've never had a room of my own. Richard felt his heart tighten once again. Do you want me to stay here until you fall asleep? Sophie nodded, looking relieved. Richard sat on the edge of the bed as she lay down, still dressed in her stained pink dress. He made a mental note to buy pajamas the next morning. Can you turn off the light? Sophie asked. Richard turned it off, and the room went dark, with only the city lights coming through the window. He could hear Sophie's breathing, slowing down, becoming more regular. Dad, she whispered. It was the first time she called him that. Richard had to swallow the lump in his throat before responding. Yes, thank you for finding me. Thank you for not giving up on looking for me. A few minutes later, Sophie was asleep. Richard sat there watching his daughter sleep, and for the first time in 15 years, he cried for real. He cried for the woman he had loved and lost. He cried for the years he had wasted. He cried for everything Sophie had been through, and cried in relief for having a second chance. But in the back of his mind, Helen's words echoed. She wasn't going to let this go. And Richard knew the battle was just beginning. Tomorrow started early. Richard woke up on the sofa, where he had ended up sleeping after hours of watching Sophie. His neck was sore, and his head felt heavy, but there was a strange feeling in his chest. It took a moment to identify what it was. Purposefully, he prepared the coffee and was trying to figure out what to do for breakfast when Sophie appeared at the kitchen door, her hair messy and her eyes still sleepy. Good morning, Richard said, smiling. Did you sleep well? Sophie nodded. The man stayed there the whole time. I did. And you can call me Dad if you want, or Richard, if that's more comfortable for now. Dad, she tested the word as if trying something new. Are you hungry? I was thinking about that. What do you like to eat for breakfast? Anything. No, seriously, what would you like to eat? Sophie hesitated for a moment. Mum sometimes made buttered toast when she had it. Richard picked up the phone and called the best restaurant he knew, ordering an absurd variety of options for breakfast. 30 minutes later, the table was covered with croissants, pastries, cakes, fruits, juices and yogurts. Sophie looked at it all with wide eyes. It's a lot. I want you to try everything and tell me what you like the most. That way I know what to buy tomorrow. While they were eating, the doorbell rang. Mark arrived accompanied by a middle-aged woman, short and plump, with a warm smile. Richard, this is Teresa Johnson. She has worked as a nanny and housekeeper for some of the best families in the city. She's retired now, but agreed to come talk to us. Teresa looked at Sophie, and her smile grew even wider. What a beautiful girl. Hi, sweetie. How old are you? 7, Sophie answered softly. 7. A wonderful age. Teresa turned to Richard. Mr. Ashford, Mark explained the situation to me. Can I be frank, please? You have no idea what you're doing, do you? Richard, surprised by her honesty, replied, None. Great. Men who think they know everything about parenting are the worst. I can help. I can teach routines, basic care, and, most importantly, I can be here when you can't. But I need to make it clear, I'm not a staff member who follows orders without question. If I think you're doing something wrong with this girl, I will tell you to your face. I would like exactly that, Richard said. When can you start? Now, if you need. But first we need to take this child to buy decent clothes and some toys. Sophie looked at Richard as if asking for permission. He nodded. Can I come along? She asked. Of course. In fact, you will choose everything. 2 hours. Later, Richard found himself in a department store, something he hadn't done in years. Teresa was running the operation like a general, selecting practical and comfortable clothes, while Sophie looked at everything with fascination. When they reached the toy section, the girl stopped in front of a shelf of children's books. Can I pick one? She asked. You can pick as many as you want, Richard replied. But I can't read. Not yet, but you will learn, and when you do, you'll have an entire library waiting. Sophie chose 5 books, all with colourful covers and beautiful illustrations. Richard added another 20 to the cart without her seeing. They also bought dolls, games, art supplies, and a pink backpack that Sophie hugged as if it were a treasure. Back at the apartment, Teresa immediately began organizing everything. Tomorrow we're going to the doctor, she announced. Complete checkup, vaccinations, dentist, everything. I've already scheduled it all, Mark informed, appearing with his tablet. And I've also scheduled the DNA test for 2 days from now. The results will be out in 3 business days. Richard nodded, avoiding looking at Sophie. He knew this was necessary, but he hated the idea that someone could question his paternity. There's one more thing, Mark continued in a lower voice. Helen called an extraordinary board meeting for tomorrow. She wants to discuss your mental stability to continue, as if she can't do that. Technically, she can. If she gets enough support from the board, they can vote for your temporary suspension. Suspension? Richard felt anger rising. Why? For having a daughter, for losing the deal with the Japanese, for acting erratically. Those are her words, not mine. She's using Sophie as evidence that you're going through a crisis and aren't fit to lead. Teresa, who had been organizing Sophie's new clothes in the bedroom, returned to the living room. Can I give an unsolicited opinion? Always, Richard said. Helen, she's not worried about the company or your sanity. She's scared. Scared of what? of losing power. If Sophie is your daughter, and from what I've seen, she clearly is, it changes the dynamics of the inheritance. It changes who gets what. Helen was comfortable being the only person entitled to your estate in case something happened to you. Now there's a child in the mix. Richard hadn't thought of that, but Sophie is 7. It will be years before she's old enough to get involved in the business. It doesn't matter. Helen is thinking long-term, and people like that are dangerous because they have no limits. Mark agreed. Teresa is right. I've seen Helen in action on the board. She's calculating and patient. If she called this meeting for tomorrow, it's because she already has guaranteed votes. How many votes does she need? A simple majority. There are 7 members on the board, including you and her. She needs 4 votes. And how many does she have? Mark hesitated. I'm not sure, but Walter Martin is close to her. They always vote together. And there are rumors that she's been talking to Patricia Smith, Walter and Patricia, 2 of the most influential board members. If Helen can convince them, she'll have her 4 votes. I need to talk to them, Richard said. Explain the situation before Helen distorts everything. I've already tried calling. Neither of them answered. I think Helen instructed them not to talk to you until the meeting. Richard ran his hand through his hair in frustration. He spent 15 years building that company from scratch, turning the small business his father had left into an empire. And now Helen wanted to take it all from him because of Sophie. He turned around. Sophie was standing in the doorway of the room, wearing one of the new outfits, a pair of jeans and a yellow top. She looked so different from the girl who had approached him on the street the day before. Yes, that woman yesterday, the one who was mean. Can she make you send me away? Richard knelt in front of her. No, never. No matter what happens with the company. You are my daughter and you're staying with me, understand? Sophie nodded, but still looked worried. I don't want to cause any trouble. You're not causing any trouble, Helen. You are, but don't worry, I'll sort it out. Teresa approached and placed her hand on Sophie's shoulder. How about we let the adults talk about boring stuff and go prepare a snack? I bet you've never made homemade cookies. Sophie shook her head, and Teresa led her to the kitchen. When they were alone, Mark sat heavily on the sofa. Richard, I need to ask you something, and I want an honest answer. Is it worth it, risking everything for... Sophie, you barely know her. If Helen gets the votes tomorrow, you could lose the company. You could lose everything you've built. Is it worth it? Richard didn't need to think about the answer. Yes, it is. Even if she's not your biological daughter and the test comes back negative, she is my daughter. I know that. But even if the test says otherwise, even if by some miracle her mother's letter was wrong, I won't abandon her. She lost her mother and is alone in the world. What kind of man would I be if I turned my back? On her now? Mark sighed. A more practical man, but that wouldn't be you. He stood up. All right, let's fight. I have until tomorrow to figure out how to stop Helen. I'll make some calls, see if I can influence any board members. Mark, Richard called him as he was leaving. Thank you for everything. We're in this together. We always have been. After Mark left, Richard went to the kitchen. Teresa was teaching Sophie how to measure flour, and the girl had a white smudge on her nose. She was laughing, a sound Richard had never heard before. How's it going? He asked. Great. I'm making cookies. I see that. Teresa, can I steal Sophie for a minute? Teresa nodded, and Richard took Sophie to the living room. They sat on the sofa, and Richard took a deep breath before starting. I want to tell you a story about your mom and me. Sophie settled in, paying attention. I met your mom 8 years ago, just like the letter said. I was starting my business and working day and night. One day, I took my suits to be cleaned at a laundromat, and she was there. Her name was Anna, right? Sophie felt her eyes light up at hearing her mother's name. Anna was beautiful. She had a smile that lit up the whole room. We started talking, and I found out she was funny and smart. I began going to that laundromat every week just to see her. Eventually, I asked her out, and she said yes. We went to a park, had hot dogs from a cart, and talked for hours. It was one of the best days of my life. We went out more after that. For 3 months, whenever I had free time, I spent it with her. "Why did you leave?" Sophie asked softly. "Because I was selfish. My business was growing fast, and I let it take over my whole life. I stopped calling. I stopped showing up. I thought it was for the best, that she deserved someone with more time. But the truth is, I was scared. Scared of what? Of not being good enough, of failing, of getting attached to someone and losing everything. So I chose the easy way and pulled away. It was the worst decision I ever made." Sophie was silent for a moment. "Mom never spoke badly of you. She said you were a good man, following your dream. Your mum was the best person I could have ever hoped for. She would be happy to know we met." Richard hugged Sophie, feeling tears burning in his eyes again. "I will do my best to take care of you, I promise." "I know," Sophie said simply. The rest of the day passed in a haze of strange normalcy. Teresa taught Sophie how to make cookies, then sandwiches for lunch, and then sat with her to watch cartoons. Richard worked a bit, answering urgent emails, but his mind was on the meeting the next day. That night, after Sophie fell asleep, Richard stayed awake in the living room, thinking Helen was right about one thing. He had acted impulsively. He lost an important deal, brought a child into his home unprepared, changed his whole life in a matter of hours, but for the first time in 15 years, he felt like he was doing the right thing. His phone vibrated. A message from Mark. "Patricia Smith agreed to meet with me tomorrow morning." "There's still hope," Richard replied with a thank you and stared at the dark screen of his phone. Tomorrow would be a crucial day. Either he would convince the board that Sophie was a strength or a weakness, or he would lose everything. But as he looked down the hallway where Sophie was sleeping, he realized he had already gained something far more valuable than any company. He had gained a daughter, and no matter what happened tomorrow, no one was going to take that away from him. The boardroom was intimidating by design. A long, polished mahogany table, Italian leather chairs, and windows offering a panoramic view of the city. Richard arrived 15 minutes early, wanting to be prepared. Mark was already there with a folder full of documents. "Did you manage to talk to Patricia?" Richard asked. "Yes, she's willing to listen, but she didn't promise anything. Walter Martin is already here and hasn't even looked at me. He's with Helen and the others. Daniel Carvalho should vote with you. He's always been loyal. Roberto Mendez is a wild card. Richard was dissatisfied with the recent financial results, so he could go in any direction. And Julia Taylor, honestly, I don't know. She is too pragmatic to predict. 5 members besides Richard and Helen needed 4 votes in total to win. Richard had his own vote secured. If he could get Daniel, Patricia, and 1 more between Robert and Julia, he would win by 4-3. The members started to arrive. Daniel Carter, a man in his 60s with a greying beard, warmly greeted Richard. He had heard the news. "Congratulations on your daughter. Thank you, Daniel." Robert Miller and Julia Taylor entered together, speaking softly. They both politely waved to Richard, but kept their distance. Patricia Smith was next, an elegant woman in her early 50s, with calculating eyes that revealed nothing. Walter Martin arrived last, a burly man with a stern expression. He sat next to the empty chair of Helen and began to leaf through some papers, completely ignoring Richard. Helen entered right on time, wearing a pristine grey suit. She smiled at the room as if she were among friends. "Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming on such short notice. I know it's an inconvenience, but I believe the situation justifies it." "What situation exactly?" Daniel asked challengingly. "The situation of our CEO acting erratically and putting the company at risk," Helen replied as she sat down. Yesterday, Richard lost a $50 million deal because he simply didn't show up for the meeting. When questioned, I found out that he was preoccupied with a child who appeared out of nowhere claiming to be his daughter. She didn't just appear out of nowhere, Richard said, keeping his voice calm. And she isn't claiming anything. Sophie is my daughter. I have a letter from her mother proving it. A letter? Helen repeated, raising an eyebrow. How convenient. And do you have proof beyond this letter? We are doing a DNA test. Ah, so you're not even sure? I am sure. The test is just a formality. Helen leaned forward. Richard, let's be honest. You are a wealthy and powerful man. People come out of the woodwork trying to take advantage of that. A woman you barely remember sent you a letter saying you have a daughter, and you just believed it. I remember Anna perfectly, and when I saw Sophie I had no doubts. Memories can be misleading. Physical resemblances can be coincidence. Helen opened a folder, but putting that aside, let's talk about your actions over the last 2 days. You cancelled 3 important meetings, didn't respond to dozens of urgent emails, not only lost the deal with the Japanese, but also irritated long-time partners. This is not the behavior of a stable CEO. I was dealing with an urgent family situation, Richard countered. My daughter had just lost her mother and was alone on the streets. Doesn't that seem like a legitimate emergency to you? If she really is your daughter, Walter Martin interrupted, and that's still in question. The test will prove it, Mark said, joining the conversation. Until then, we need to consider whether Richard is fit to continue leading this company. Helen continued, I propose a temporary suspension. Mark can take over as interim CEO until the situation is resolved. Suspension. Daniel slammed his hand on the table. This is ridiculous. Richard built this company. 1 or 2 days of absence do not justify this. It's not just the days of absence. Julia Taylor spoke for the first time. Her voice was soft, but there was steel in it. Helen is right about one thing. The numbers from the last quarter were not good. We lost market share to competitors, and now we've lost an important deal. Add to that a complex personal situation, and yes, there are reasons for concern. The numbers from the last quarter were affected by external factors, Richard explained. The global economic crisis, regulatory changes, unfair competition, things any CEO would face. But not any CEO brings personal drama into the company, Helen said. Personal drama. Richard felt anger rising. We're talking about a 7-year-old child who lost her mother. This isn't drama, Helen. It's real life that is interfering with your work. Patricia Smith cleared her throat. Can I ask a question, Richard? Of course. What do you intend to do moving forward? How will you balance your new responsibilities as a father with your responsibilities as CEO? It was a fair question, and Richard knew his answer would determine her vote. I hired Teresa Johnson, one of the best nannies in the city, to help take care of Sophie. I will establish a routine that allows me to be present for both my daughter and the company. I will delegate more, something I admit I should have done a long time ago, and I will prove to all of you that I can do both. Nice words, Walter grumbled, but actions speak louder. So, judge me by my actions in the coming days, not by the last 2, Richard said. Give me a chance to prove that I can make this work. And if you don't succeed? Julia asked. What if, in a month, we're having this same conversation because you lost more deals or because you're too divided? Then you will have reason to replace me, but give me this chance, at least until the result of the DNA test. Helen laughed. Are you hearing this? He wants us to wait and see if the child is really his before making a decision. And if she isn't, all this drama will have been for nothing. If the test comes back negative, which it won't, I will still take care of Sophie, Richard said firmly. She lost her mother. She is alone. I will not abandon her. Oh, how noble, Helen said, sarcasm dripping from every word. So you're saying that regardless of the results, you will continue with this distraction in your life? She is not a distraction. She is my daughter, and yes, I will continue to care for her. If that is a problem for you, Helen, the problem is yours, not mine. The silence that followed was tense. Robert Miller, who had been quiet until then, finally spoke. I have 3 kids. When the first one was born, I thought I was going to lose my mind trying to balance work and family. But you know what happened? I learned to be more efficient, to prioritize better, to delegate. It made me a better businessman, not worse. He looked at Richard. I'm willing to give you that chance. Richard felt a weight lift off his shoulders. Robert's support was a vote in his favor. Robert, with all due respect, Helen began, but he interrupted her. No, Helen, you're using this situation to advance your own agenda. Everyone here knows you've always wanted more power in this company. This is just your excuse. How dare you? I dare because it's true, Robert said calmly. Richard made a mistake by missing that meeting, but it was a mistake for a valid reason. It doesn't justify a suspension. Daniel nodded in agreement. Robert is right. I also vote against the suspension. That made 2 votes for Richard, 2 against Helen and Walter. Only Patricia and Julia remained. Richard looked at them, trying to read their expressions. Patricia was the first to speak. I spoke with Mark this morning. He showed me the reorganization plan you proposed. More delegation, more flexible hours, better communication systems. It's solid. She paused. But I want to make it clear. I will be watching. If this negatively affects the company, I will be the first to call for your replacement. I understand, Richard said. That said, I vote against the suspension. For now, it was 3 votes for Richard. He just needed 1 more. Julia was the last. She remained silent for a long moment, her fingers drumming on the table. I have to admit, I was leaning towards voting for the suspension when I came in here. The bad numbers, the lost business, all this confusion seemed like too much. Richard felt his stomach tighten, but Julia continued. Helen, you overstepped. It became clear to me that this isn't just about the well-being of the company. It's personal, and I don't vote based on personal agendas. She looked at Richard. I will vote against the suspension, but Patricia is right. We will be watching. Richard took a deep breath, relieved. 4 votes against 3. He had won. Helen was pale with rage. This is a mistake. All of you will regret it. The meeting is adjourned, Daniel said, standing up. And Helen, a suggestion. Accept defeat with grace. One by one, the board members left. Patricia stopped beside Richard. Don't let me down. I won't. When they were alone, Mark let out a long sigh. That was too close. I know, Richard. Helen won't give up. She will be waiting for any slip-up from you. I know that too, but for now we won, and that's what matters. They returned to Richard's apartment, where Teresa was helping, Sophie with the puzzle in the living room. The girl looked up when they entered. How did it go? Teresa asked. Well, all sorted out. Sophie ran to Richard and hugged him. I was worried. You don't need to worry. Everything is fine now. But even as he said that, Richard knew it wasn't entirely true. Helen had lost this battle, but the war was far from over, and he needed to be prepared for what came next. Later that night, after Sophie went to bed, Richard received a message from an unknown number. When he opened it, he felt his blood run cold. It was a photo of Sophie on the street 3 days before she found him, and below it, a simple message. People disappear every day in this city. It would be a shame if something happened to your daughter. Richard immediately called Mark. We have a problem. A serious problem. Richard didn't sleep that night. He sat in the living room with all the lights on, the phone in his hand showing that threatening message. Mark had insisted on calling the police, but Richard refused. No, I still don't know what I'm facing. Involving the authorities could make things worse. At 6 a.m., Teresa arrived and immediately noticed that something was wrong. What happened? Richard showed her the message. Teresa paled but kept her composure. Helen, probably, or someone she hired, but I have no proof. So, what are we going to do? I'm going to hire security for Sophie. For you, for me. No one gets near her without my permission. And Helen, are you going to let her get away with this? For now, yes, until I'm sure and can prove it. I can't accuse her without evidence. Teresa pressed her lips together, clearly dissatisfied, but nodded. I'll stay with Sophie all the time. I won't even leave her alone to go to the bathroom. Thank you. Sophie woke up shortly after, still wearing the new pajamas they had bought. She immediately noticed the tension in the air. Did something happen? Richard forced a smile. Nothing for you to worry about, but we're going to have some extra people around here in the next few days. Security. It's just a precaution. Sophie didn't seem convinced, but she didn't insist. While Teresa prepared breakfast, Richard received a call from Mark. The DNA test is ready. Already. They said it would take 3 days. I paid to expedite it. I thought you'd want to know the result as soon as possible. And it's 99.9% compatibility. Sophie is biologically your daughter. Without a shadow of a doubt, Richard felt his legs weaken. He already knew. Of course he knew, but hearing the official confirmation was different. Send the results to all board members and especially to Helen. With pleasure. After hanging up, Richard went to the kitchen where Sophie was eating toast with jam. He knelt beside her. I just received some news. The test results came in. Sophie stopped chewing, fear evident in her eyes. And it's official now. You are my daughter. You always have been and you always will be. Sophie's eyes filled with tears. I was afraid the test would say I wasn't. I never had any doubts, not for a second. They embraced and Richard felt something he couldn't describe, relief, joy, and an intense love that hurt. The rest of the morning was spent organizing security. Mark. Richard hired a top-notch security company, and within a few hours, discreet security personnel were positioned throughout the building. One of them, a former police officer named Mark, would be specifically responsible for Sophie. In the afternoon, Richard received a call from a private number. He answered, putting the call on speaker so Mark, who was visiting, could hear. Hello, Richard. It was Helen. Her voice was icy. I saw the results of the DNA test. Congratulations. What do you want, Helen? I want you to know that this isn't over. You may have won this battle, but I'm going to make your life a living hell. Every decision you make, every move you take, I'll be there to question. Empty threats don't scare me. They're not empty, and I'm not just talking about the company. There was a pause. That girl, Sophie, she's so fragile, isn't she? So vulnerable. Richard felt his anger explode. If you lay a finger on her, I didn't say I would do anything. I just noted that she's vulnerable. Bad things happen to vulnerable people all the time. Did you send that message last night? Helen laughed. What message? I don't know what you're talking about, but if you received any threats, you should go to the police, unless you have reasons not to want the authorities' attention. Richard was about to respond when Mark signaled for him to stop. He was typing something on his tablet. She's recording. Don't admit to anything. Richard took a deep breath, controlling himself. This call is over, Helen, for now. But we'll talk soon, Richard. Very soon. She hung up. Mark immediately started making calls. I'm going to hire a private investigator. If Helen is behind the threats, we'll find out and have proof. And in the meantime, keep Sophie safe. Don't leave the house without security and keep your enemies close. What do you mean? Invite Helen over for dinner. Here at your apartment tomorrow night. Have you lost your mind? Think about it. If she's planning something, it's better to have her where you can see her. And in front of Sophie, she'll have to pretend to be civil. This might give us clues about her intentions. Richard hated to admit it, but Mark was right. Fine, I'll invite her. The next morning, Richard took Sophie for her first medical appointments. The doctor confirmed that she was surprisingly healthy, considering the circumstances, but malnourished and with some vaccinations overdue. They spent the afternoon correcting that. At the dentist, they discovered that Sophie had 2 cavities. "Does it hurt?" the dentist asked. "Sometimes," Sophie admitted. But Mom didn't have money for the dentist. Each new discovery about Sophie's life before him felt like a stab to Richard's heart. While she received treatment, he sat beside her, holding her hand. That evening, Helen arrived promptly at 8. She was impeccable, as always, wearing an elegant black dress and bringing a bottle of expensive wine. "Richard, thank you for the invitation. Come in." Helen scanned the room until she found Sophie, who was sitting on the sofa next to Patricia. And here's the little heiress. "Hello, Sophie." Sophie didn't respond, only curled up closer to Patricia. "She's shy," Richard said, leading Helen to the dining room, where the table was set. During dinner, Helen was all charm and politeness, talking about business and making light jokes, but her eyes kept returning to Sophie, who ate in silence under Patricia's protective gaze. "She's quite quiet," Helen commented. "Her mother was like that too. Her mother was an incredible woman who raised a wonderful daughter all on her own." Richard set the tone, making it clear that the subject was not open for discussion. "Of course I didn't mean to offend." Helen took a sip of wine. "It must be hard for you to learn to be a dad overnight. I'm learning, and if there's anything I can do to help, you can stop with the threats." Helen widened her eyes in false innocence. "Threats? What are you talking about?" "You know exactly what I'm talking about, Helen. I think the stress is making you imagine things." She turned to Sophie. "What do you think of your new dad, dear? It's nice living here in this huge apartment." Sophie looked at Richard, uncertain how to respond. He gave her an encouraging nod. "It's nice," she said softly. "He's nice to me." "How lucky you are. Not every kid gets a millionaire dad as a gift, Helen," Richard said in a low, dangerous voice. "What?" "It's just a comment." She smiled, but there was no warmth in that smile. "Anyway, I need to go. Thank you for the lovely dinner." After she left, Richard locked the door and checked all the windows. Patricia took Sophie to brush her teeth, and Mark, who had stayed in one of the rooms during dinner, came out. "Did you get anything?" "She's good," Mark admitted very carefully, "but I noticed something when she looked at Sophie. There was real hatred there. It's not just about business or power, it's personal. For Helen, Sophie represents everything she doesn't have: youth, innocence, and most importantly, a real connection with you. Helen spent 10 years trying to become indispensable at the company, trying to be the most important person in your life after your father died. And then Sophie shows up and in 2 days wins something Helen never could: your unconditional love." Richard had never thought of it that way. "That makes her more dangerous, much more. People motivated by jealousy and personal hatred are unpredictable." In the following days, Richard established a routine. He woke up early, had breakfast with Sophie, took her to the new private school where he had managed to enroll her at the last minute, went to the office, returned in time for dinner with her, and put her to bed. It was exhausting, but it was also the most rewarding thing he had ever done. Sophie was adapting surprisingly well. At first, she was scared of the school, but the teacher was kind and patient, and within a few days, Richard had already made a friend. Seeing Sophie laugh and play like a normal child should was like watching a flower bloom. At work, Richard was also proving his point. He regained 2 important clients, who had been dissatisfied, closed a new deal that compensated for the loss of the Japanese clients and implemented the changes he had promised to the board. Helen continued to be difficult in meetings, questioning every decision, but she no longer had support from the other members. It was in the third week that everything changed. Richard was in the office when he received a frantic call from Patricia. "Richard, Sophie is missing." The world stopped. "What? I was in the kitchen making lunch. She was in her room doing homework. I went to call her for lunch and she wasn't there. I searched the entire apartment. She's not here. And Mark, the security guard? He says no one came in or out, but she's not here, Richard." Richard was already running to the elevator. "Call the police." "I'm on my way." The journey to the apartment was the longest of Richard's life. 1,000 thoughts raced through his mind. The message, the threats, Helen. When he arrived, he found Patricia crying, Mark talking to police officers, and the apartment being searched. "Are you sure she couldn't have left without you seeing?" Richard asked Mark. "Absolutely. I have cameras at all entrances. No one came in or out, so she's still in the building." They began the search floor by floor. Richard knocked on every door, explained the situation, and asked for permission to check the apartments. Most neighbors cooperated, shocked by his desperation. It was on the 15th floor that he found her. A door opened before Richard could knock, and Helen was there with Sophie beside her. "Looking for someone?" Helen asked with a mischievous smile. Richard felt a blind rage. He stepped forward, but Sophie ran and hid behind him. "Dad, I didn't want to come. She made me." "Made you?" Helen laughed. "I just invited the girl to see my apartment. I didn't know she had left without permission." "You entered my apartment and took my daughter," Richard said, each word coming out between clenched teeth. "I didn't go anywhere. Sophie came on her own." Helen looked at the police officers who had arrived. "Isn't that—" "Right, dear." Sophie was trembling. "She knocked on my window from the outside." "From the outside?" One of the officers frowned. "But you live on the top floor." "There's a fire escape," Helen explained calmly. "It connects my apartment to hers, and I didn't know Sophie would use it to come down. I thought the door was locked." It was a blatant but clever lie. Without proof that Helen had forced Sophie to come down, it seemed like just a misunderstanding. "Did you plan this?" Richard said, ignoring the police officers. "All this time you were waiting for the perfect opportunity." "I don't know what you're talking about, but since we're all here, I need to say I'm concerned about Sophie's safety. She managed to leave your apartment without anyone noticing. That raises questions about your ability to care for her properly." Richard realized the game. Helen had orchestrated everything to make it look like he was a negligent father. "Sophie is a minor," one of the police officers said. "And if there are doubts about her safety—" "There are no doubts," Richard interrupted. "Sophie was safe in my apartment until that woman manipulated her." "Manipulated?" "She came to my door voluntarily." Sophie tugged at Richard's shirt. "She said you were here, that you were hurt and needed me." Helen shrugged. "Kids have vivid imaginations." Richard wanted to strangle her, but Mark, who had arrived with the police, placed a hand on his shoulder. "Richard, calm down." The police officers took longer questioning everyone, but in the end, there was no clear crime to investigate. Sophie was fine. No one had been hurt, and Helen had plausible explanations for everything. After everyone left, Richard took Sophie back to the apartment. Patricia hugged her, crying with relief. Mark looked pale, with guilt. "I should have checked the fire escape. It was my fault, wasn't it?" Richard said, "It was her planning. She waited weeks for the perfect opportunity." Later, after putting Sophie to bed and staying by her side until he was sure she was resting, Richard returned to the living room where Mark was waiting for him. "She went too far," Mark said. "We need to put an end to this. Since she's too smart to leave evidence, we'll use another strategy. We buy her off. Richard looked at Mark in surprise. Helen wants money. Offer it to her. Buy her shares. Offer more than they're worth. Take her completely out of the company. She'll refuse just out of spite, maybe. But there's another option. Mark took a deep breath. Expose her publicly. The investigator I hired found some things. Questionable transactions, conflicts of interest, even hints of insider trading. Nothing solid yet, but enough to start a serious investigation. Are you suggesting I blackmail Helen? I'm suggesting you throw her own tactics back at her. Make it clear that if she comes near Sophie again, you'll ruin her reputation. Helen cares about appearances, about prestige. Threaten that, and she'll back off. Richard thought for a long moment. This wasn't how he wanted to do things, but Sophie was in danger, and he would do anything to protect her. Schedule a meeting, just me and Helen, tomorrow. The next day, Richard and Helen met at a discreet cafe. She arrived with her usual confident smile, but it faded when Richard placed a folder on the table. What's this? Your exit. Inside was an offer to buy all her shares for 3 times their market value. And there's something else interesting, evidence of your questionable activities over the past few years. Helen opened the folder and paled at the sight of the documents. You have 2 choices, Richard said calmly. Accept the offer, sell the shares, leave the company, and my life forever. Or I turn everything over. This is for the relevant authorities and the press. I imagine it's hard to maintain your elite friendships when you're being investigated for financial fraud. You wouldn't do that. Try to test me. You threatened my daughter, Helen. There's nothing I wouldn't do to protect her. Helen was silent for a long moment. Finally, she closed the folder. How much time do I have to decide? 48 hours. She stood up to leave, then stopped and looked back. Do you think you've won? But raising a child is much harder than running a business. Let's see how long you can hold out before you realize it's not worth it. It's already worth it, Richard replied. Every second with her. It's worth more than all the deals I've ever closed. Helen left without another word. 2 days later, she signed the papers, sold all her shares, and resigned from the board. Richard never heard from her again. 6 months later, Richard was sitting on the living room floor, surrounded by Lego pieces, helping Sophie build an impossibly complicated castle. Patricia was in the kitchen preparing dinner, humming a tune. Mark had just left after a work meeting they had right there in the apartment. Dad, does this piece go here? Sophie asked, holding up a red piece. Richard studied the instruction manual, turning it upside down, trying to understand. I think so. Or maybe there. Sophie laughed. You're not very good at this. I admit that building Lego isn't my specialty. That's okay, I'll teach you. And she patiently and gently taught him, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. When they finished the castle, it was already late. Sophie yawned and Richard carried her to her room. Dad, yes? Do you think Mom would be happy with what? With us? With how things are now? Richard felt the familiar tightness in his chest. I think your mom would be very happy. She loved you more than anything in the world, and all she wanted was for you to be happy and safe. I am happy and safe. So am I. Sophie snuggled under the covers. You know what's funny? What? Before I met you, I was so scared. Scared of being alone. Scared of not having a place to live. Scared of everything. And now I'm not scared anymore because I know you're here. Richard kissed her forehead. And I will always be, I promise. I love you, Dad. I love you too, Sophie, more than you can imagine. He stayed there until she fell asleep, watching her breathing become slow and steady. 6 months ago, he was a man obsessed with work, measuring his worth by closed contracts and numbers in a bank account. Now his greatest achievement was sleeping peacefully in that room. Richard had built an empire from scratch, had won and lost millions, had faced ruthless competitors and emerged victorious. but none of that compared to the challenge and reward of being a father. Sophie had come into his life holding a crumpled letter and asking for help to read words she didn't know. And in that moment, unknowingly, she had rewritten his entire story. She had shown that real success was not measured in money or power, but in love and connection. She had saved him as much as he had saved her. Richard quietly left the room and found Patricia tidying up the kitchen. She's asleep, as always. She asked me to read 3 chapters of her book. First, Patricia smiled. She's learning quickly. The teacher said Sophie is almost at her grade level. She's smart. She always has been. She just needed a chance. You're doing well too, Patricia said gently. I know you were insecure at first, but you've become a wonderful father. I'm still learning. All parents are always learning. The trick is not to give up. After Patricia went home, Richard stayed in the living room looking out the window at the city below. His phone buzzed. It was a message from the board. The results from the last quarter had been the best in years. He smiled and put the phone away without responding. Tomorrow he would deal with that. For now, he had something more important to do. Richard picked up the photo album he had started to put together. It was filled with moments from the last 6 months. Sophie on her first day of school, Sophie with ice cream all over her face, Sophie and him building that impossible Lego castle. Each photo was proof that he was finally doing something that truly mattered. He added one more photo taken that day and closed the album. On the cover, he had written by hand, "Our story, Richard and Sophie Ashford." A story that had begun with a crumpled letter and a brave girl who didn't give up on finding her father. A story of second chances, redemption, and the transformative power of love.